It's a very sensitive topic, and it has a tendency to bring up a whole wide range of emotions. As that occurs in each and every one of us, depending on our life histories and the scenarios that we have experienced in our own lives, there may be a triggering effect. Please be mindful of any emotions that do come to the surface. I want you to know that this is a safe space for us to have an open and honest conversation, to be able to really uncover what is going on in the dynamics of domestic violence and how somebody goes through the process of change to where they can finally break free from these chains that bind them. So domestic violence it's not going to be very easy to spot, right? It doesn't come with bruises. It does not come with a black eye. Domestic violence can be very, very under the surface. So although a person may be experiencing some type of a trauma going on in their home environment, in this relationship that they have with their significant other, it's not always physical. It could be something that is psychological, mental. And so we're not going to be able to readily see that. Another thing is that the people that are experiencing domestic violence in their lives, they may not always be in imminent danger. So there may not be exigency at that time. Maybe that person is starting to feel a little controlled or uncomfortable with the dynamics. They could be being forced to do something that they don't want to do. They don't want to rock the boat, cause any waves. So they just kind of go along with whatever that request is. Or they could be intimidated, right? Intimidated by the partner. All of these things are signs of abuse. Domestic violence, though, is a little bit different. It is something that is chronic. It often will start very simplistic, usually verbally, and it escalates over time, and it builds over time into this chronicity that we see. So what exactly is domestic violence then? Well, it's an abuse of power. It's a power and a control. It's perpetrated mainly, but not only by men against women, because women too can be domestic abusers. What usually we find is that domestic violence will happen when one partner attempts to either physically, emotionally, psychologically, or financially dominate and control the other. What's going on below the surface of that need for dominance and control is an out of control, probably an avoidant, anxious, attached type personality. Okay. Now, there is a cycle of domestic violence. It's not something that everybody understands, but the more that you are exposed to the cycle, the more it'll start to click and make sense. Oftentimes people say, why don't they just leave? Why don't they just get out? There's a lot of different things going on. And sometimes what seems crystal clear to some of us may not be for that individual, because depending on where they are at in the cycle and where they are at in their motivation to change is going to have a lot to do with their ability to move forward and to take those action steps. So this whole cycle of violence that we're talking about when it comes to domestic violence, it is a cycle of events that are happening. It's an abusive, toxic type relationship. Usually there's some form of love bombing where they're flooding this person with a lot of positive affirmations and goodness, and this person is just being placed on a pedestal. And that's kind of like somebody casting a line, a fishing line, and then they reel that line in. They have hooked the individual into this dynamic. Now, this toxic relationship will then begin to evolve. It might happen within a couple of hours. It might take up to a year or more for the entire domestic violence cycle to complete itself. But nonetheless, it will begin usually with a love bombing, flooding of positivity, where the individual is kind of reeled into the scenario with this toxic person who has this desire, this need for control. Because internally, things are chaotic. They're not controlling their internal dialogue. They have a lack of inability to control their own emotions, and they're reliant upon an outside source. The same thing for the victim. The victim is attempting to connect with a person that they feel that they can be connected to, that has their best interest in heart. And they're looking for their affirmations and positivity to define themselves from an outside source versus having that from within themselves as a healthy relationship would. Domestic violence is not just physical violence. It spreads over an entire myriad of different types of abuses. The most common is physical abuse, because you can physically see injuries, right? I can see if somebody has a handprint on their face from being struck. I can see if somebody has a black eye because they have been punched. Those are visible. What we do not see is the emotional side of things. What's going on below the surface and the internal talk that goes on for the person that is being victimized. That emotional abuse can take its toll on an individual, and it begins to really break them down, break down their self-esteem, break down their identity, who they are as a person, because again, they are looking to that outside source to affirm them. They're looking for that outside source to let them know that they are worthy, that they belong, that they are loved. And if that is absent, and in place of those positive things is jealousy, anger, intimidation, controlling, right? That's where the abuse comes in, because the person who is wanting to receive all the positivity is being flooded with negativity and harm. Emotional abuse can be anything from something that we say that hurts that person, all the way down to removing them from being able to have access to other people, or telling them they're unworthy of having any relationships with anybody else besides the perpetrator or the abuser. There's a form of social abuse too, where people are stopped from being able to see their friends and their family. Sometimes in certain situations, they can't leave their house. And in dire situations, they may even be stalked. Domestic violence is very unique. It's unique to the individuals who are a part of the toxic cycle. And depending on how those two people, how they were raised, what their attachment style was to their primary caretakers, will have a lot to do with the forming of this type of a relationship. Now, as far as other forms of domestic violence, we have sexual abuse and also economic or financial abuse. Sexual abuse does occur in domestic violence situations. Again, it's another type of power and control. It's forcing somebody to do something that they don't want to do. They are not inclined to do it. It might follow a physical abuse episode and then turn out to be a sexual abuse episode following, because the perpetrator is now attempting to control in a different manner. Economically, this could be where one person is controlling all of the money. I've had situations that I've investigated where maybe the mother is the breadwinner, and she's going out, she's working, she's bringing in the funding to the home, and the live-in boyfriend, who is the domestic violence perpetrator, is using all of that for drugs and alcohol. Bills are not getting paid, and he's kind of just disseminating money for her to be able to purchase little amounts of food or something here and there. Financial abuse is real, and it does happen. And again, it is control. It's controlling the access to money or other kind of resources where the victim is being forced to live without money or sufficient amounts of money. So now we know a little bit about the types of abuse. Let's go ahead and move forward and talk about the cycle. The cycle of domestic violence is actually a four-part pattern. It's a four-part pattern in the abuse that occurs in this relationship. So the four cycle areas are tension building, incident, where the emotional, the violence, physical abuse, something occurs. Following that, there's a period of reconciliation. This is where the abuser is apologizing, they're giving excuses, or maybe they're blaming the person, you made me do it. Like, if you hadn't said that, this would have never happened, type thing. They may even deny the fact that the abuse has happened, minimize it, or tell the victim, it's really not as bad as you're saying it is. You're really blowing this out of proportion. And so then what we have after the reconciliation, the victim now is inclined, because this person is going through motions of trying to reconcile. They want to go back to where it was in the very beginning, when that person was love bombing them and giving them all this positive affirmations, making them feel so valued, so appreciated and wanted. And they desire to have that back. And so we find that when that reconciliation has passed, there's a honeymoon phase or a calm. That's kind of like where they both just forget about the incident. Things have kind of come back to a homeostasis, a place of balance, and there's no abuse taking place here. Now, this particular cycle can happen weekly, it could happen daily, monthly, or it can go long periods of time and there'll be an incident and the cycle will continue. What we know about domestic violence is that it does increase over time. So if it starts out with verbal, over time, the perpetrator is going to kind of push that envelope to see what type of a response they can get from the other person. Because remember, they're trying to fill their own cup too. They are a dysfunctional person with a skewed attachment style. And so with that is going to come the desire to control their external environment and anything in it. So during that tension building phase where everybody's kind of like on eggshells, feeling like something's getting ready to happen, this is where things start going a little awry. Maybe that abuser is starting to get a little angry. The victim recognizes the fact that something's building. And if this has been happening over time, they start to get a feeling or a sense of the impending doom that's coming. So they will do everything in their power at this time to try to de-escalate the situation. It might be giving in to that perpetrator, appeasing them, telling them what they want to hear, trying to do everything right, have all of their ducks in the row so that they will not escalate the situation any further. They're hoping to put off the actual incident, which will be following. But during this time, the tension building, both the victim and the abuser are going through a huge, wide range of emotions. This is very unsteady at this point in time. Everything is off balance. There's tension that's building. There might be some stonewalling where maybe one person is not speaking to the other person. And it could be that that individual is just trying to keep out of the way. They don't want any eruptions of violence to happen. But when things are really, really tense and You have a person who has the desire, the need for control, because internally they're out of control. That's what it starts to increase the threat of violence, because they are trying to find their own balance, but they are unhealthy in the way that they perceive the world and the way that they interact with it. The second stage in the cycle of violence is the actual incident. This is where the violence occurs. It can occur physically or any of those other ways that we just mentioned. As that tension begins to build up and that abuser becomes increasingly more irritable and more unable to regulate their own emotions, they've got to find a way to try to find balance again where they can feel control. And what will happen is they will start dishing out. It could be fits of rage. It could be verbal abuse, put down, shaming. Whatever is that trigger, think of it as a volcano that is building and building and building below the surface. At some point, that building is going to reach a head, and it has nowhere else to go but out. And so as this abuser and that tension is building within them, much like a volcano, it's all going to come out. And it just depends on their style of violence. What we've found with a lot of perpetrators is that they witness domestic violence in their own homes. And so they have basically latched onto the ideology of that person that they, what would be the way to say it? The person that they most identified with. So for example, in my situation, my father was the abuser, my mother was the victim. And so I kind of latched onto my mother's perception of how to live and how to stay out of the way, how not to get somebody upset when they start to get irritable, to be doting and loving and try to do as many positive things as possible to offset that tension. So it just depends on who that individual identified with, and they usually will pick up those habits because that's how they form the basis of relationships, is from their role models, right, in their own homes. So during this cycle where there's this huge incident, okay, and the tension has erupted into violence of some kind, this tension building phase, the abuser can become very irrational. And in some situations, they can be really dangerously violent. They may even kind of disassociate. There's a splitting that occurs, and it becomes very black and white for that person. In their mind, they are looking at the person that they're supposed to be loving, right? Their significant other, the victim. But for some reason, they can't see the gray area in between. You're either all good or you're all bad. And in this stage, the other person is all bad. They can't feel the connection or the love for that person. And that's how it gets so over the top. They get blinded by their irrationality, and the anger, the emotion takes complete control. And depending on how they erupt is what that incident will be like. It's how it will unfold. So during this time, the victim who is experiencing this explosiveness from the perpetrator, they really feel hopeless. They're trying to protect themselves, and they may even try to reach out for help from others, but they do have a tendency to keep coming back to the scenario. There's a thing called a trauma bond, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Now, after that incident has occurred, and most often, people don't report these incidents. They try to contain it within their home dynamic. They try to appease and get back to a place of balance. But ultimately, they're just wanting the violence to stop. And they have hope in their heart that eventually, hopefully, this will end. And so when that reconciliation period comes, it's like a hit of dopamine in their brain. And it hits them because it's that feel-good feeling again. The abuser is starting to feel remorseful. They're starting to apologize for what they did and how sorry they are and how they'll never do it again. They'll make all kinds of promises. And in most situations, that victim who is now latched on to the cycle because of their own attachment styles that they formed when they were children, they want to believe in the good and they want that love bombing that they had in the beginning to come back. They want to love and be loved. And this abuser is making them feel, again, like, you know, they're a wonderful person. They didn't deserve what happened to them. Even if this has happened time and time again, it is a perpetual cycle that person is in because they're wanting to be loved. And their idea of love has been skewed by their own attachment style that they formed when they were children. Now, in this type of situation where this reconciliation is still going on, there might be something else that happens. Instead of all of these promises that they'll never do it again and they're so sorry, they may push the blame onto the victim and make it sound like the reason I did this is because you made me do it, right? They put all the blame on that other person. If you hadn't said this, if you had just done this, right? That abuser is taking no accountability, no responsibility for their actions or what they did. And if that victim has a certain kind of attachment style where they are people pleasers, they want peace, they want calm, they have low self-esteem, they want to believe in the good of the person, they just want that happiness back, they may start to believe that they did do something wrong and they will apologize. I am so sorry that I did that. Had I known, I would have never done that again. I will never do that again. I'm so sorry I upset you. And yet they were the one that was abused, but they don't see it. They don't see it. They just see they were the catalyst. They were the cause of this turmoil. Okay. There might even be gaslighting that goes on in these scenarios during the makeup phase. Now, you would think if a person is attempting to make up and reconcile, they'd be doing everything within their power to affirm the person and to try to make things just and right, but that's not always the case. They may try to change the whole dynamic of what just happened and create an entirely different scenario so that the victim starts to question their own reality. Maybe I did do that. Maybe I did say that. Maybe he didn't do that. And they start to question. They start to question reality. They have a hard time with short-term memory. They are very confused. It's almost like a fog that comes over them because that abuser has assumed control. That gaslighting, if that victim is not aware that that's what's going on, they're just going to think, I just see the world differently than they do, and I'm the one that's wrong. This happens time and time again, and it's really heartbreaking to see. The abuser might even minimize. They may say something like, oh, I slapped you. I didn't slap you that hard. You act like I did so much to you. What about when you, or why are you going behind telling people about the things that are going on with us when you're making up lies? You're not even telling the truth. You didn't tell them what you said just before all this happened, right? So deflecting, minimizing, and that person who is the one being abused starts to kind of look at their world through the eyes of that abuser and think, are they right? Is that right? Now, following that reconciliation period, there is the honeymoon phase. This is the stage where it's kind of like the calm after the storm. Everybody's just trying to catch their breath. The victim is trying to gain some type of bearings, if you will. They're trying to get rooted and grounded again. The honeymoon phase is just an interim phase. This part is where maybe they're going to start living like nothing ever happened. And they have in their mind, the abuse is going to stop. It's not going to happen again. He really meant it this time, or she really meant it this time. We are not going to do this to each other. We're not going to do this in front of our kids, right? And this calm is where that abuser maybe starts giving some gifts or some other type of token of affection. Here, honey, come lay down with me. Let me brush your hair for you. Whatever that affection style that they have, they will just pour it on at this point in time. And because they're getting that love bombing again, right? They're getting all of that validation from their perpetrator. They're feeling this false sense of security, believing in their heart of hearts that it's finally over. It's finally over. I'm not going to be put through that situation again. They really meant it this time. But this is where the cycle will begin again. And it'll be that building phase, that tension, the explosion, the reconciliation, and then the honeymoon. Depending on the people, that cycle can happen weekly, daily, monthly, or there can be long periods of time in between. It just depends on the dynamics and the level of stress and the internal chaos going on within that perpetrator. Now, I mentioned a little while ago about reactive abuse. Reactive abuse is real. So think about it like this. There's an act of violence going on between the perpetrator onto the victim. And it's common for that abused person, right, that victim, to lash out. They lash back out. The lash out that they are exhibiting is completely out of character for themselves. At this point, they've kind of reached their own breaking point, right? They've contained within them all of this pain and this suffering, and they have not had a voice, right? They're not speaking their truth. And so at this point, when it has become more than they can bear, they will begin to possibly scream, cry. They'll throw insults at that perpetrator. They may even begin to physically defend themselves against the attack from that individual. And in turn, the perpetrator may retaliate against them and start calling them the abuser. They may take out something and videotape the victim reacting because they want that as proof to show that this person, the victim, if you will, is unstable. They're crazy. They're mentally ill. They are the violent one. When in reality, the person is reacting to ongoing abuse until they couldn't contain it anymore. And it just kind of explodes out of it. It is reactive to the actions of the other person. So why don't they leave? Why don't they leave if all of this stuff is going on and this cycle continues? I have investigated thousands of families in my experience in 22 years with the department. And in the very beginning, I had that question too, even coming from my background. Why don't they leave? But when you understand the true dynamic of what's going on with the people caught up in this cycle, it won't make sense, because this does not make sense, right? It's irrational. Healthy people form healthy relationships because healthy people have formed healthy attachments in their childhood with their primary caregivers. So if I have a child who's living in a household where they have an unpredictable caretaker, there's violence going on in that home, they walk on eggshells, or they are being neglected in some kind of way, they themselves may form a type of attachment style that leaves them vulnerable and open to this type of situation. You will usually find an anxious attachment style individual with an avoidant attachment style individual. And the reason for that is the anxious attachment is so worried that that person is going to leave and abandon them. They have childhood wounds that go way back to the trauma that they experienced of abandonment. And when you have an avoidant attachment style who does not deal with conversations about emotions, their emotions are suppressed, they cannot self-regulate emotions, they will usually link with an anxious attachment style and they trigger each other. And so until that underlying root cause of the attachment is addressed, that domestic violence is a perpetual cycle until the person realizes, I need to do something to change. This is not getting better. But it takes time for a person to understand that, because who they are now has been shaped over the past however many years of development. And they have to change their whole outlook, their perception, because they don't even see the safety issue in it. All they see is the attachment to the other person. And they don't want to be the one that leaves that person, right? Just like everybody else did. They want to be the special one, because truly that anxious attachment style person wants to belong, and that's what they're seeking. So why don't they leave? Let's talk about some current myths, some common myths when it comes to DV victims. Domestic violence only happens in poor families. No, domestic violence does not care what socioeconomic status you have. It does not care about what ethnicity you are. All levels of society, it does not discriminate. As far as domestic violence is concerned, all are welcome. It can occur in any income level. You would think that in situations where people have high sources of income, right? Dual household earners, domestic violence happens there. It doesn't matter what occupation a person is in. You can be in a role of law enforcement. You could be in a role as a nurse. You could be in a role as a teacher, right? Domestic violence does not discriminate. It does not care where you're employed. It depends on the people in the dynamic and those attachment styles. Myth number 2, domestic violence is always physical abuse. No, it's not. It doesn't always leave a bruise. It doesn't always leave a broken bone. Sometimes it leaves a broken heart and an emotional scar that you cannot see. The majority of families served by Child Protective Services and any multiple agency in Kern County have likely experienced some form of trauma or some type of abuse. Any one of the types of abuses that we've already talked about, right? We don't know somebody's trauma history. I can't look at a person and see them eye to eye and know everything about their experiences in their childhood, in their adolescence, their attachment style, how they cope, their own coping skills. I won't know any of that. All I will see is face value, right? And so going into this ideology that we have to have a trauma-informed perspective, you have to look at things in a different way, not what's wrong with them. What happened? What happened to that person that over time, their attachment style was identified and they formed relationships throughout life based upon that foundational attachment style? If we don't see that and we don't take into account that person's trauma history, we begin victim shaming, and we don't want to be victim shaming. Myth number 3, that victims have the types of personalities that attract abusive partners and encourage abuse. It has nothing to do with the personality. You could be the nicest person in the world, and you may still end up with an abuser. You could be the meanest person in the world, and you may end up with an abuser. It has nothing to do with personality. It has to do with attachment style. That has nothing to do with your personality. If we say certain people are more prone based on their personality because maybe they are weak or they're very passive, they just let people walk all over them, they don't have a voice, that's low self-esteem, right? That would be a form of victim blaming, but it's really, really common in our society. When we don't understand something, we're more apt to blame somebody or shame somebody because we're uncomfortable with our uncomfortability. We don't understand. So we will try to latch onto the way that we might be able to make it make sense for us. She's staying because she wants to. She doesn't want to change, type thing. But really, studies have been conducted over time, and they found that there is no standard set of personality traits amongst the victims. It has very much to do with that perpetrator, their attachment style, and the type of people that they latch onto. And it's usually going to be somebody who has an anxious attachment style because they want to be loved. And the avoidant attachment wants to control, and then they want to run, which triggers that anxious attachment style because they're like, don't leave me, don't leave me. And the avoidance, like, get away, it's all your fault. And that anxious person's like, please, I'll do anything, don't leave me. And the victim begins to beg for that person to stay. And it's this back and forth dynamic. It doesn't have anything to do with personalities. It has everything to do with who they are inside in their attachment style that was formed. And get this, it's usually within the first year of life. So we can say that leaving, it's not as easy as just making that decision to walk out the door. Depending on the circumstances going on in that relationship, that dynamic, it could be very, very dangerous for that person to try to leave. Even if in their heart of hearts they want to, it may not be something that they can access. Because remember, that perpetrator, the abuser, is so desirous of control. They have internal chaos, and so they want to control their victim, and they may even begin to ramp up, increase the severity or the frequency of the abuse so that they can try to control that person and try to get some balance within themselves. That's the only time they really feel like they're in control. They don't like the feeling of vulnerability. They want to have everything the way that they want it because it makes them feel safe. But it's making the other person completely unsafe. But they don't see that. So when we have someone who is making the decision that they are ready for change, that they don't want to go through this anymore, they're probably starting to look into a lot of self-help, maybe going online, looking up some sites, trying to access some information, figure out a way out. But really, the most safest thing for them is through a domestic violence advocate. They can work with that survivor to come up with a safety plan, a comprehensive safety plan, so that they can separate safely. Okay. In ideology, walking out the door would be amazing. But how many times do we hear in the news all over the nation, even in movies that we watch, that it doesn't always go as planned? And in fact, that's where it can get very, very dire and dangerous. Let's talk about homicide statistics when it comes to domestic violence. Firearms are the weapon of choice for domestic violence homicides. So people are reaching for weapons, for guns. In 2015, there were 928 women that were killed by male intimate partners. And most of those victims were killed by firearms. 1 in 3 female murder victims and 1 in 20 male murder victims are killed by their significant other. 35% of all women killed by men are killed by intimate partners with guns. 76% of women murdered by intimate partners and 85% of women who survived murder attempts were stalked by that significant other first. They were mapping them out. They were seeing where they were and what times and planning. Because again, this person is not in their control and they are struggling internally to find that balance. And this person, this victim, is keeping them from their balance. And so that's where they tip over the edge. They want their balance. They're keeping their balance away from them. It's their fault. And if I can't have you, nobody will have you, type thing. 44% of mass shootings between the years of 2008 and 2013 involved intimate partners. It just reminds us of how prevalent this actually is. When you are talking intimacy and connection and relationships, right? Whoever this person is, what they bring to the table, they're bringing all of their stuff. They're bringing their childhood trauma, they're bringing their life experience, their coping skills, all of it. And it doesn't matter the setting because the person is still the same, even if they're in an outdoor arena, an environment. They're irrational at that moment in time. And all they want is to stop the person that's causing them this internal discomfort and preventing them from being balanced. And that victim just wants to get away. The perpetrator is wanting to assume control and authority over the individual. And the ultimate control is the loss of life. Women in the United States are 11 times more likely to be murdered with a gun than in any other high-income nation. Now, that's to say, guns don't kill people. People kill people, right? And so we have a perpetrator who's imbalanced. They've gone through this cycle of violence with their victim. And at some point in time through that reconciliation phase, the victim has decided they want out and they're going to take the necessary steps for change and get out of that situation, maybe by talking to an advocate and creating the safety plan. But in the midst of that, that perpetrator who has had control over this person this whole time is now left without any control in the situation. So you can imagine that spiraling effect that's going on internally with them. When it comes to domestic violence cases, there is an increased risk when we're working with these families, especially if the abuser has access to a firearm. The risk of that victim being murdered by that perpetrator rises by 500%. So if we think about standard protection orders that are offered by law enforcement for individuals, they don't always require a person to relinquish weapons. It just depends on the scenario, the situation. But if we have a protection order, in my experience in working with families, they feel like it's a piece of paper because that person, if they want to get to them, they're going to get to them. And by the time law enforcement arrives on scene, things may have already unfolded because it takes time to respond. And people react instantaneous. People die in a matter of a second. That's how quickly things happen. There was a study of intimate partner homicides, and they found that 20% of victims were not the intimate partners themselves. They were other people. They were bystanders or first responders who were trying to help. And they became victimized, and they died by interacting and trying to assist in the situation. Sometimes just being present. I heard of a story where this man was upset with his partner. He went to her home. He killed her, 2 of their children, and her mother was there. So he did away with her also. Now, it wasn't a murder-suicide, but he did away with all of them because she just wanted to move on with her life. She wasn't even dating another person. She just wanted it to stop. There was a protection order in place, but he come creeping over to the house late at night, and they weren't expecting him, and he accessed the house, and it happened. And the mother, the grandmother of the children, she lost her life, as did the kids and the mother. 72% of all murder-suicides involve an intimate partner, and 94% of those victims of those murder-suicides are female. So we have to think about the survivor. They're going to know when it's the safest time to leave, right? Because there's going to be barriers in their way. First and foremost, they have their own attachment styles, their own mindsets. They have to be able to kind of rise above that, see the world from a different perspective. And it's hard when you are a victim and you've already been beat down emotionally and you have very low self-esteem, to find and dig within yourself that wherewithal. Oftentimes it's because they have kids and they don't want their kids being exposed to this anymore. That's usually a catalyst for them. But that survivor knows their perpetrator. They've been involved with them. They know the triggers. They know that cycle of violence. And ultimately, they're fearful. They're afraid that that perpetrator is going to harm them, harm their children, and in some situations, they harm the family pet as a way to control. Okay. That person, the survivor, may not have the means financially because maybe there was financial abuse in that relationship and the perpetrator was the one who controlled all the funds. So this victim, survivor, doesn't have a means to go anywhere without them knowing, right? Because they keep such close tabs on the money, even if they're not the earner, they still know where all the money's going. Sometimes the survivor, because they've gone through this cycle so many times, maybe their family and friend is just sick of it. They're sick of trying to help them and trying to help them get away and get out. And they burn bridges because they keep going back to their perpetrator, right? Like kind of a Stockholm syndrome, if you will, where a person falls in love with the person that's harming them because it's based on basic need. They're in fight or flight. And so they want survival. They try to link on to the person that's causing the abuse for their own life, if you will. And so it causes this skewed mentality where that person is the perpetrator. They're giving them positives, but they're also the ones that's dishing out all the harm too. This survivor might also have a dependency on that abuser. Maybe the person who has been abused, they're disabled, or they're dependent upon that other person for their citizenship. It could be a lot of different things, financially dependent. They may even be in a mindset that maybe it isn't as bad as it is, or it is as bad as it is, right? They might fear losing their kids through the court system because remember, reactive abuse. And during those incidents, the perpetrator has probably had their cell phone and they're recording the reactive abuse. The survivor exploding because they cannot take it anymore. Well, now there's all these videotapes of that person reacting. That perpetrator can turn around and say, hey, look, this is how this person was acting. I feel my children would be unsafe. She's very unstable. Okay. And when a person is in the midst of abuse, when they are the ones receiving the abuse, talking survivor here, they're probably not going to whip out their phone and start recording, right? They're not going to have the wherewithal to do that and record and build a case against this person. Somebody who is honed in on the control aspect is going to be recording because they want evidence to prove that they're not the bad person. It's this other person's fault. Look at how they act. And I was merely being calm, and this is what this person was doing and saying. They're unstable. They're crazy. Sometimes there's pressure from family to stay, or religious beliefs or teachings that make them feel that leaving would not be justified. You're supposed to stick it through, right? You're supposed to stay and fight through it. All right, we've talked about the 4 stages of the cycle of violence. Now let's talk about what is going on with the person as they are beginning to leave a domestic violence relationship. There's 7 stages. Stage 1, this is where the abuse is happening. The abuse stage is where the abuse is happening, but the victim at that point in time, they haven't identified or acknowledged that they are an abused person. Because through the course of that cycling, right, that rapid cycling, depending on how quickly the incidents and that honeymoon phase and all of that happens again, it's altered them. It's cognitively altered them, the way they perceive the world, the way they feel about themselves, where they fit in that dynamic, but ultimately of themselves. They've lost themselves somewhere along the way. There's some internal dialogue going on within them that says, this isn't right, right? It's that inner voice, that inner knowing, and they continue to stay. They're not showing up for themselves. And because of that, they lose perspective on their self, and they become numb and they don't even know who they are anymore. The second stage is the victim is denying the abuse. They feel like they've lost total control. They've lost the love. They've lost the connection, the attachment. And remember, most of these people are going to be anxious attachment style, and their greatest fear is abandonment. So here they are, very apologetic. They feel so full of shame. They're fearful of the unknown, the withdrawal of love, their abuser going on and being with somebody else and becoming who it is they were supposed to be for them. They isolate from family and friends because family and friends are onto it. They're seeing it. They're seeing how this person has changed since they got together with this person. And friends and family are going to speak up if they love you, right? I don't like how he talks to you, or I don't like how she talks to you. I don't like what's going on. I'm fearful for you. And so this victim is going to think they're against us. They're against us. And so they want to disrupt what we have. It's not that bad. It's all my fault. My family and friends can't see that. I'm just not going to go around them anymore. And the perpetrator is happy about that, right? Because what do they have? They have that control. That person is not going and talking to other people about what's going on in the privacy of the home. And so they have a fixed audience of their victim. At this point, this stage, the victim, most of them have not even acknowledged the fact that the relationship that they are in is a violent one. It could be all verbal at this point, right? And they're not making the connection that the psychological and the emotional toll that it's taking on them is affecting them, and it's altering their perspective of who they are and they don't see it. Stage 3 is where the survivor, the victim, is acknowledging the abuse. Maybe, just maybe, a family member or a close friend is able to get through to them, right? And at that point, that victim acknowledges for the first time that they are in an abusive relationship. They will start to identify situations where abuse has occurred or some type of trauma in that relationship has occurred, and they are starting to recognize and see it. Kind of the wool has been pulled off of their eyes. That fogginess is starting to lift, and they're acknowledging that this is not right. Stage 4, the acknowledgement of the abuse is taking place, and now there's going to be some emotional fallout. The emotional response that follows for that victim is going to depend on the person. Some people, that intensity is so overwhelming, they shut down. They shut down emotionally. It's just so overwhelming, they can't even come to terms with it. So it's just going to vary from person to person how this emotional response shows out. They could go into a deep depression, disconnect. A lot of different things can happen here, because not only now are they dealing with the fact that the abuse has happened, they're having to come to terms with the emotions that are associated with all of that abuse, and it's painful. It really resembles the process of grief when we lose somebody that we love. We lose somebody, and there's no right or wrong in that processing of grief. You know, those stages of where you are in denial, you try to rationalize it, you try to come up with ways to make it go away, and at some point in time, you begin to accept. Right? There's some anger in there too. And it's just this whole process of grief that people go through. Every person's unique. And so the time frame for that grieving process, it varies from person to person. At this stage, stage 4 is where the victim's willpower and motivation to flee that situation is increasing. They have finally come to terms and acknowledged that what's going on here is not right and something has to change. I don't want to live like this anymore. I want to break free from this. I don't want my kids to experience this anymore. So in stage 5, that victim is motivated and they're starting to make the preparations to leave. The motivation stage is where they're trying to gain some sense of self-control. They're wanting to take control of their own life. Because up until that point, the perpetrator, the abuser, has been in a mad rush for control of all, because internally they're in chaos. And the only way that they can find balance is in the control of other people. That's where they feel safe. But it causes disruption and unsafety for everybody else around them. This person doesn't want that anymore. They want their life back. They want to make their own choices. They want to be in control of their own life. They don't want to be dictated anymore. They don't want to be browbushed and made to feel inferior and less than, right? They want their life back. So here's where they'll begin really accessing sources and resources, planning those next steps so that they can eventually attempt to go and flee that abusive partner. But it's a very delicate process because it could be very volatile. As we saw from all those statistics, there's a great likelihood of a bad outcome at the time of leaving. That's when it's increased, because that perpetrator is completely out of control, and they are wanting to gain control of the situation. They want control of the victim. In stage 6, a form of abuse occurs and triggers the victim into action. Now, once this victim has set forth all the preparation and planning for that moving, for that leaving, there's a triggering event that usually will happen just before they go. But don't not think that that perpetrator hasn't caught on to the fact that something feels off. The victim has been a certain way for a period of time, and that perpetrator has come to rely on those indicators that that person is under control. And they feel it in the very nuances of the energy coming off of the other person. You can feel when somebody is ignoring you. You can feel when something doesn't feel right and you're connected to another person. It stirs something in you. Things feel off. That abuser is going to feel it. And so there may be a triggering event at this stage, an episode, a physical episode, or something so fearful, so severe, it could even be fatal, because they are wanting to gain control. They do not want their source of all their energy that they are receiving and gleaning from the other person. They don't want it to go away. And this avoidant person, this attachment style, has an underlying fear of abandonment as well. And so if they feel that this is a forever thing, this person is trying to leave me, this is where they may physically really harm a person, and there may even be death. But there are instances where even after that incident happens, that huge explosion, the survivor lives and they're able to escape that environment. These are former victims. They're now survivors. They have removed themselves from the abuse. Safety is now their number one top priority, and they are choosing to invest their energy into their healing and their recovery and that of their children, if there's children involved. The victim no longer sees themselves as a victim because for once they have showed up for themselves. They see themselves as survivors because they have autonomy, self-control, and they are dictating their own life and their own well-being moving forward. But it requires change. It's not something that happens automatically. There's so much going on below the surface. It's easy for people to look at a person in a domestic violence relationship and shake their head and just wonder, why are you still there? Just leave that person. Okay. But we understand there's a cycle of violence that happens. It affects a person psychologically. There's things that have to be taken into consideration as they are planning to leave. And it's first even acknowledging that there is violence. That can go on for years and the person may not even recognize it. What if they grew up in a household like that and that was normal for them? Okay, they may be drawn to partners that are similar to what they already know. So with change, we need to talk about the stages of personal change. So it'll make more sense of where a person really needs to be in order to take the action steps necessary to leave and to stay gone, because some return. There's 5 stages of change that a person goes through when they're making life changes. And this is pretty much for any life change. Okay. First, there's pre-contemplation. You haven't really thought about it yet. It's not even on the radar. Then it's on the radar. You're thinking about it. That's that contemplation stage. Then there's preparation. Okay, you know the steps that you need to take. You're preparing to take those action steps because you've made a decision that the change is what is needed, and you're going to do what you need to through your actions. And after you take the action, you're going to maintain the new change. But these stages are not linear. They vacillate. So they go back and forth, right? While that person is dealing with the internal dialogues and their own cognition, their worldviews, their perception, all of that, everything has to change because it has been a certain way for so long. So in that pre-contemplation stage, the person is not even aware that there's a problem, and they're not even interested in changing anything, right? Because they're in denial. They're in denial. His behavior's normal. Or everybody has conflict in marriages, that's normal too, right? So they haven't really honed in on the fact that what they are experiencing is not healthy. It is not normal. But to them, they've rationalized at this point, it's not a big deal. Things are okay. Then there comes the next stage where there's this contemplation and the person is starting to recognize that maybe there is a problem. And they're starting to weigh the pros and the cons. Well, if I change, if I leave him, this is what'll happen. If I stay, this is what's going to happen. And they're trying to make sense of it, right? Trying to find balance in their dynamic. They're at least thinking about it now and seeing that a problem may exist. Then there's preparation. This is where the person is like recognizing there is a problem and I've got to do something. I've got to get out of here. So in this stage, they are starting to make plans. They're reaching out for help, accessing services or resources, talking to people, trying to find out how to change their life circumstances, developing concrete steps for getting out, an action plan or a safety plan with an advocate, okay? Because they do recognize now that there is a problem and it's not going to change. The only way things will change is if they've removed themselves from that scenario and take control of their life again. So then the person moves to action. They're starting to implement the plan. They're actively working on changing. They're continuing to seek help from other professionals, adjusting their plan as they need to. Ultimately, they're wanting to get completely out and stay out long-term, not wanting to go back to that same situation or relationship. So the next phase is maintenance. Once that person has taken the action necessary and removed themselves from that environment, from that person, now they have to maintain the change. And how many of us know how many times it takes a person to change before they actually stick to it, right? It takes a lot of effort. And those internal scripts in the mind that play over and over, negative self-talk, starting to feel guilty, feel remorse for leaving, start thinking about the honeymoon phase and all of those things. Some people get sucked out of the maintenance phase and they're right back in the cycle of violence with the person starting at the honeymoon phase until it starts again. So relapse is possible here. They may go back, okay? That action plan has to be adjusted as needed. They need a lot of support in the maintenance phase because relapse is likely. And relapse means returning to the abuser, because that abuser is going to put on all the good, right? They're going to put that mask on and they're going to be everything that that person hoped for that they would have. And we're always trying to attain in the relationship. But now they're not with that person and that person's doing much better, right? And they're doing all the things and all the changes that they said they would do in our relationship without me. And I'm going to miss out on that. I want their love. And they go back to the old patterns and the way of thought going back into the cycle of violence until they activate the stages of change again. It's a vicious cycle. So on average, a person may go through the stages of change at least 7 times before full recovery or change happens. And as we know, people with substance abuse issues go through treatment, and on average, it takes them 7 times for full recovery too. It's just the way that it is. It's the cycle, and it depends on the internal strength of the person, how they perceive themselves and the tools that they have. If there's not enough there, they're going to revert back to old ways of thinking and old ways of doing, which means going back to those scenarios because it's what they know. So I now see how owning our story and loving ourselves through that process is the bravest thing we will ever do, because going through the changes needed in order to remove oneself from a volatile situation takes a lot of internal will, takes a lot of change, and it takes maintenance of that change. You're going into the unknown, and you're not leaning on another person. You're doing it for yourself because you don't want to go through that scenario anymore. And it's brave because it's life and death in a lot of situations. Let's talk about the effects of trauma, because we know in domestic violence, the majority of the families have children at home. And even if we have a little baby who's in the midst of that violence, they're still absorbing everything in their environment, right? They don't have a way to vocalize. They're holding it in. But when they come to be about 2 or 3 years old, when they're starting to socialize more, those effects that they are experiencing are now showing up in pre-K, right? They're aggressive towards other kids or things like that. It starts to show up. There are short-term and long-term effects of trauma. The first one is anxiety. People who have experienced trauma, this could be the children witnessing the abuse, this could be the victim who's experiencing the actual assaults, they have really high anxiety. And that anxiety will plague every waking moment of their life. Think of a person being in a fight or flight response long-term. You know, that little alarm bell that goes off within us if we're starting to cross a street and we see a car and we're like, oh, and we stop, like, oh, that was close. That fight or flight is our safety net. It's how we respond to outward stimuli that's threatening. Our bodies are never intended to be in a perpetual state of fight or flight. The body is not set up for that. It is only set to do a little alarm bell and then bring us back to a balance. But trauma holds a person in that fight or flight. It increases levels of cortisol, adrenaline, right? All of these different chemicals that are released when we are fearful of our safety or something. And it floods the body, and it has adverse effects on the body. And one of the ways that it affects us is mentally, increasing that level of anxiety. Just waiting for something to happen. It's kind of like walking on eggshells continuously. That's very heightened. They will usually experience things like high blood pressure, cardiovascular issues, because the heart's just pumping, right, at higher rates, and the respiration's increasing. And it's staying that way for long periods of time, not to mention all of those chemicals flooding the body. And if a person is experiencing trauma daily, they're never coming out of fight or flight. And the kids that are in the midst of all of that, seeing everything, hearing everything going on, they're in a state of anxiety too. Chronic fight or flight with the same chemicals flooding their little bodies. Trauma can also cause people to re-experience abuse, flashbacks, triggered by certain reminders. right? They begin to actually relive the experience. I've talked with some of the people that have survived domestic violence, talking with the kids, right? And having them share with me their experiences. And as they're sharing, they kind of stare off blankly and they're just describing things in detail. And I can see, well, as I'm having a conversation with them, they're there. They're in that moment. They're back in the space where that occurred. They're reliving it. So all of those feelings, those emotions, the anxiety flood them. They re-experience it as if it is happening in real time. Same thing with victims. It could be a song playing on the radio. It could be a smell of a cologne. It could be a lot of different things that trigger. This could be a person who's no longer in the relationship, but they are re-experiencing the trauma while they're trying to recover from the abuse. Physical symptoms of trauma show up too. A person who is in heightened states of trauma usually are not very good at self-care, making sure they're eating enough, drinking enough water, getting enough rest, right? Things we take for granted. They may be plagued with anxiety or panic attacks. They may not have the coping skills necessary to kind of pull themselves out of this deep pit of despair. And with that flooding of different chemicals, it does stuff to the body. It changes the body and it changes the connections in the brain. All of the communication going on internally with the synapses, the firing of the information in the brain, different types of connections are made, right? And so this person may have a hard time concentrating. They may be in a state of fog, trying to cope. The physical symptoms of the trauma are real. They're real and they are alarming as the physical injury that they experienced to begin with. Okay. So if they're re-experiencing or flashbacking, they can actually be re-experiencing the physical assault, the verbal or mental assaults, and any type of abuse. It's going to show up. We'll see it in behavior changes too. So sometimes people will try to turn to different things as a coping mechanism. Could be substances like drugs or alcohol. Some self-soothe with food. Just trying to cope with whatever it is that they have experienced. We may even see people doing things that's completely out of character for them, risky or dangerous behaviors. Because again, the trauma that they've experienced, all of the hormones that are associated with this toxic trauma that they have been experiencing over time, it changes a person and it takes time to heal. Now, health issues are going to be probably one of the predominant things we may see for prolonged chronic abuse. When we have higher levels of cortisol, adrenaline, the chemicals in our body that basically throw us into fight or flight, that amount of chemical can actually cause widespread inflammation in the body. We know from inflammation that inflammation can cause a lot of adverse serious health issues for people. Cardiovascular disease is one of them. Because the heart rate is increased, the respiration is increased. High blood pressure is another one. Okay, so we might see a person who has been in a long-term domestic violence relationship get out of that situation and then begin experiencing significant health issues. It's because the body has been in this chaos for so long with all of these chemicals, and now that environment is different. So the body has to adjust to the lack of whatever is the trigger for that, for those responses. So they're having to reacclimate, trying to find a sense of balance, and health issues may show up. Cognitively, we can see effects of trauma. Because whenever you are in a state of fight or flight, you're operating from a different part of your brain than you would be when you're fully alert and concentrating and being effective. When you are in fight or flight, you're completely in your emotion center. Your thinking brain is knocked offline. So you may have issues with like memory, cognition, inability to focus or concentrate. This can affect people in different areas of their life. Maybe they can't work or they can't focus at school because their body, their brain is just so hijacked and they're in their emotion center. So they're only using and operating coping skills that they have developed as children. Okay. So here are some safety tips when we are working with domestic violence families, things that we need to keep in mind. Be aware of the cycle of change and the possibility of the fact that the person may resume contact or a relationship with that abusive partner. Remember, we talked about the fact that stages of change, and it takes at least 7 times on average before it actually solidifies. They may go back and forth. It's not to say all do, but the majority will. We also have to be aware that situations that involve that dynamic of domestic violence or partner violence, there's going to be an increased risk of violence while we provide services, interventions, right? It's very volatile. We have to be very, very tactful in the way that we approach that situation because it can turn very quickly. Being prepared mentally and physically to remove ourselves from violent situations, we have to listen to that internal guide. Listen to your gut. You know, when you're in an environment and something feels off, you could be anywhere. You could be driving around town and you go to a certain area and something feels off to you and you get back in your car and you go. You feel it, okay? So listening to that gut and removing ourselves from situations that have that likelihood of volatility. Safety first. Another question we need to ask ourselves is, for this family that we're working with, are there any restraining orders, stay away orders that are currently in effect? And if so, are those orders being violated? Okay. Make sure that any cell phone device that you have access to emergency contacts, agency contact numbers that are quick access if needed on your cell phone. And I always encourage, if you're not aware of what the abuser looks like, maybe there is a stay away order in effect and we're working directly with a parent and children, we might need to see a photo, right, of the abuser so that when we go into interactions with that family, we can be on the lookout for our safety too, right? Because we know, should that perpetrator show up, there could be potentially an increased risk of violence. And studies have shown that people that are bystanders or providing services can be at risk for harm too. These situations with domestic violence are very emotionally charged. The people that are in that dynamic could still very well be in the fight or flight, that fight or flight response mode. And when they're in that mode, they are not in their thinking brain, right? They are all in emotion center. What we can do in that interaction is remain calm. If we start to escalate, it causes an escalation with other people. Coming across as empathetic, kind, considerate, supportive, right? Throughout that rapport building phase where we're trying to get to know that individual for a services portion, trying to get to know them, see what it is that they may need, being aware of their trauma history, preventing any re-traumatization from me to the person, because we want to be a trauma-informed approach, that people who have experienced trauma need empathy and support in their interactions. They will mirror the calmness that you provide by setting a feeling of safety in your interaction with them. We want to also be familiar with the environment that we're providing the services at. So if you do any type of home calls, anything like that, I always encourage, do a one-time drive by the house. If you're doing services in home, go around that neighborhood, kind of get an idea of, what's in the neighborhood, know your exit routes. I always park a couple of houses down from the house that I'm going at. I just like to be able to leave and to not be front and center. When we go inside the home with the parent permission, pay attention to exit routes, have a clear vantage point of how to get out of there, right? So if I enter a home and I'm sitting down with a family and having a conversation with domestic violence as an issue in that family, when I sit down, I'm sitting closest to the front door with my back against a wall where I have an easy path out. I'm not going to leave my back open and vulnerable to a hallway or to other parts of the house where I don't know where somebody may be coming from. Also, in that environment, you need to know who's all there. I've had experiences before where they said nobody was home, and suddenly I have 2 or 3 people coming from back rooms of the house down a hallway, and I'm not prepared for that. So now I always ask, who all is here right now? And can they go ahead and come out so I can see them, type thing. I need to gauge for my safety, right? Lastly, acknowledging the unpredictability of situations that domestic violence cases bring. We have to be alert. This is not a time to sit idly by. It's a very volatile situation. Just because we're there doesn't mean something will not happen. It could potentially happen with us present, and we have to know how to respond accordingly to keep ourselves safe and to do what we can do for that environment, whether that be calling 911 or whatever our plan may be. But it's very unpredictable. All right, let's go on to some indicators of abuse. Physical indicators of abuse are the most pronounced because it's something that we can see visually. We can see a bruise. We can see human bite marks and head injuries. We can observe blood, right? Physical indicators of abuse could also be in the behaviors that we see. So we might have a person who is leery of any type of physical contact, maybe very anxious, fearful. Extreme behaviors could be aggressiveness, destructive type behaviors, obnoxious, or the whole other end of the spectrum, overly compliant. Okay. Emotional abuse is one of the most challenging in my field of child protective services to prove. There has to be specific indicators that the actions or lack of action by that parent or caretaker has resulted in disturbed behavior of the child. Okay, but this could also apply to adults in these type of situations. Depression and anxiety are very common. Eating issues, self-harm, right? I've had a lot of family members, parents going through domestic violence, and they are so rattled internally with all of the anxiety. They are not hungry, and they've gone days without eating, days without even drinking water. And they're so exhausted, but they can't sleep. So they have insomnia. So not only are they nutritionally deprived, they're sleep deprived. If they do sleep, they're probably experiencing some nightmares or reliving the experiences. People in a state of emotional distress have a really hard time being consoled. They don't find any peace or comfort in those hugs, words of encouragement, right? They are just so far off in their sadness, in their despair, that they may turn that sadness and despair into hurting themselves, wanting to escape the pain, wanting something to end, maybe suicidal attempts, or they may be successful. Self-mutilating behavior, cutting, self-harming, burning themselves. This could be the children too. Okay. There could be assaultive behavior going on in that family dynamic between the kids because they are exhibiting the behaviors they saw from the adults that are their mentors and their role models in the home. So how do parents inflict emotional abuse on their children? One of the key ways that a parent does this is to provide unpredictable or inconsistent parenting to their children, along with the fact that they are verbally assaulting the child. So this could be a parent who the child's crying, they need attention. Sometimes when the parent comes, they're nice to them. And sometimes when the parent comes to the child, they scream at them and they hit them and tell them to shut up. You're always loud. You need to be quiet, right? So it's unpredictable. The child begins to not know what to expect. They form an anxious attachment style because they don't know. Their parent is unpredictable. Are they going to be nice? Are they going to be mean? Are they going to meet my needs? Or are they going to yell at me because I need something? Okay. So an avoidant attachment style is where a parent is completely emotionally unavailable to their child or unresponsive most of the time. Child comes up to them, taps them, mom, 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 and the parent is just stone-faced, not saying anything, and the child will go away. The parent's unresponsive. Or that little one needs a hug or something, and they're coming for reassurance and love, and the parent's like, go on, get away from me. I can't stand you. You're so annoying. Okay. The parent will also disregard or ignore the child's needs, especially rejecting that child when they're hurt or they're sick. So a baby crying, maybe they're wanting formula and the parent is avoidant of the child because they are in their own feels. They're not wanting to be disturbed by the child. They'll leave them crying for hours until that child self-soothes and stops crying. And eventually they're not going to cry for things that they need anymore. They're just going to lay there because help is not coming. The avoidant parent discourages any type of emotional expression by that child. Crying is not acceptable, and it forces the little one to not develop healthy emotions and healthy coping styles. Anxious attachment style is where parents themselves are anxious and they interfere with the child's autonomy or their exploration. They're scared they're going to get hurt. They don't let them explore. They try to control everything in their environment. We might see a parent who's really overprotective and they're promoting that dependency in their children because they want to be needed, right? That fear of abandonment, even from their own children. So this kind of parent, the anxious attachment style, they really struggle to separate from their child. And they're more likely to kind of foster anxiety and to not allow that child's independence. At some point, a child is supposed to differentiate from their family of origin, right? They're supposed to be able to self-identify, move out, get their own job, get their own place, and do adulting. Anxious attachment styles, they find reasons for their kids not to get licenses, not to move out, and they put a lot of pressure on their kids to stay. It's not for the best interest of their child. It's because that parent is anxious, right? And their autonomy, their individuality is dependent upon somebody else. They're looking outside of themselves to feel fulfilled. So emotional abuse and domestic violence victims, the 5 most common forms of emotional abuse are gaslighting, trying to distort reality, the silent treatment or stonewalling. This is where the person just is not talking at all, and it's a form of punishment. And it makes the person who is in that state of not receiving communication to feel devalued, to feel unworthy, unloved. They start to look internally, what's wrong with me? There's crazy making, where things are just so chaotic. The person is just made to feel like they are absolutely crazy because there is no balance to the situation. Reality is completely distorted. There's emotional baiting, and there's also minimizing. So most victims that experience this type of abuse, they were in an abusive relationship, usually before, right? So they have a tendency to be in relationships where there might be these type of things occurring, but they couldn't put a label on it. It is not the same thing as angry outbursts, screaming, yelling, or occasional name calling. It is actual abuse that affects the psyche, the emotion center, and the psychological experience of that person. Gaslighting is very manipulative. It's where the perpetrator is trying to rewrite or reinvent reality, and they're trying to convince the victim that what they see, what they experience and feel is not accurate, right? So that person, that victim, begins to distrust themselves, and they start thinking like something's wrong with their memory. They don't remember things right. The silent treatment is so very hurtful because, as we know, that victim is wanting interaction, they're wanting stimulus, they're wanting approval. And if the perpetrator is giving them prolonged periods of silence, they withdraw their attention, they withdraw all affection. It's just to elicit their compliance and their control. That perpetrator is punishing them, trying to get them into conformity, to act and behave and do what it is that they want them to do, right? Because they have that internal chaos going on and they want control, they want balance. So they're going to punish the person whom they want that balance to be provided from until they relent and give it to them. That silent treatment can go on for days and weeks, months. And imagine what it feels like to be in a situation where no matter what you say to a person, they are not speaking to you. And you probably didn't even do anything wrong. They just want that control. The crazy making is where I'm a victim of domestic violence. This person has emotionally abused me. They have made me feel shamed and blamed and kind of stripped down my sense of self. And I am trying to come forward and have a conversation about how this makes me feel. What is being done to me? And as soon as I do that, my abuser is going to do a switch. Okay, they're going to turn it around on me. They are going to start talking in circles. They're going to change topics. They're going to point blame at me. And suddenly, as I'm sitting there hearing all of this, I lose track of the point of what I brought to them to begin with, right? Whatever that grievance was that I attempted to raise, I have now forgot it because my perpetrator has switched it up and made me the bad guy, and they are the victim. And now I'm saying sorry because the way that they've presented the information to me, They have gaslit me into believing that my perception of reality is distorted and I'm not seeing things accurately, that I'm actually the abusive one and they're not, because of my reactive abuse, right? That they have on video. Emotional baiting is where the abuser ensures that the victim looks like the crazy one, because the abuser, by all outside people, wants to be idealized. They have a goal of wanting to be on top, right? They want everybody to think that they're a good person. And so that victim should not be gossiping and telling other people about what's really going on in the house. They are emotionally baiting that person so that they will feel like they are completely crazy, and they'll tell friends and family, she's the crazy one, I'm the calm one, like she goes off, let me show you the video of what she did last night. And this was all because I asked for whatever it was, right? Look at how she reacts. Here's where it gets really sinister, because people who engage in the emotional baiting, when they are in the getting to know you phase of the relationship, and that victim feels safe in their presence, they just feel like they could really trust them. They're sharing all of their life experiences and their traumas because they're thinking that this person truly cares for them. In that love bombing phase, they really believe that they've met the one. This person loves me. They care about me. They want to protect me. And so they just divulge everything about themselves. And then that abuser takes all of those vulnerabilities, everything that the victim thought that they were sharing with somebody that they trusted, and they use it against them. They will take those privately shared traumas or fears and push the victim's buttons, right? They're saying things like, oh, yeah, well, when you were younger and your dad used to hit you, it's probably because you act the same way that you act right now. So I can understand why he did that, right? So that might be something they say. Or, man, you told me about like your history when you were younger and you were sexually abused. Like you probably liked it, huh? Yeah, that's gross. You're just a gross person. Like who does that? And so that person who has shared their trauma feels completely violated. The person that's supposed to support them and love them and encourage them is shaming them and making them feel horrible. And what's going to happen?
Oh, we had technical difficulty. Bonnie, we lost her. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Bonnie, are you there? Okay, so we have a few more minutes left in this training. Oh, okay, she completely dropped. So as we allow Bonnie to return to the training, I did see some questions on the chat. Some of the questions were if you can get a copy of the PowerPoint. At this time, that was one of the questions I was going to ask Bonnie towards the end. However, she still hasn't been able to reconnect. So if you do want to get the PowerPoint, you can go ahead and email me and I will ask her. At this time, unfortunately, she hasn't reconnected. I guess we'll just give her one more minute, see if she's able to join. This meeting has been recorded. However, the recording may be too long to send out. So I do ask that you do bear with us just so we can figure out if there is a way we can arrange with providing the recording to the supervisors so they can share with their staff. And then I will definitely get back to those that would request it. So what I am going to do, I'm going to go ahead and include my email in the chat. If you guys have any questions regarding this training, you guys can go ahead and send me an email with any of the questions you may have. I see Bonnie still hasn't reconnected. Okay. So, and I keep seeing the question about interested in receiving the recording of the presentation and a copy of the PowerPoint. So for that, I do have to request that from Bonnie. It would be her that authorizes the release of the presentation and PowerPoint. If you can go ahead and send me an email with any questions you may have regarding requesting the information, or any questions that you may have had for Bonnie regarding the presentation, you may send them to me and I will definitely share them with her so she can respond to those. Okay, I still do not see her connecting, so I do want to give her one more minute. I know we have about 6 minutes left of this training, so while she tries to reconnect, I do want to share that the collaborative meeting that will be held next week on April 20th will also be virtual. This training, or it will be a keynote speaker that will be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you receive emails from our from the Kern County Network for Children, you have received the attachment flyer with the information as to how to connect to the collaborative meeting for the month of April. If you have not done so or received the flyer for Dr. Jessica Price, I will be including it in this chat. Okay. And let me see, Bonnie. Okay, Bonnie still has not been able to reconnect. And of course, this is part of technology. Sometimes we do have these glitches. But like I mentioned, if you want to go ahead and send me your email, if you wish to request information, or you have questions for Bonnie that you wanted to ask towards the end of this presentation, I can definitely share those with Bonnie. At this time, I am open to any questions for us regarding the keynote speaker for the collaborative, and I do invite that everyone do partake. This is a really great topic, as we want to definitely bring awareness in our community. Okay. Okay, Bonnie still has not connected. Okay, so I do want to thank everyone. Oh, and I do see a message from AJ Espinosa. He apologizes due to technical issues with Bonnie's computer. So once again, I do want to thank everyone for joining us at today's meeting. We really appreciate your support in bringing this topic out to the community. It is very important to be informed, as domestic violence is a real issue in our community, and we definitely want to make sure that we are informed. Those who enjoyed this presentation, I will let Bonnie know that, you know, we truly missed her towards the end, but you know, it is understandable technical difficulties do occur. Okay. So, and I keep seeing on the chat questions regarding requesting copies of the presentation. Once again, if you want to go ahead and send me an email, and I will definitely put a list together of those that are requesting the presentation, and I will share that with Bonnie for per your request. Okay.
Hey, I just wanted to mute myself real fast. My name is Alfonso Espinosa. I'm AJ Espinosa. I'm Bonnie's supervisor. She's gonna come up to my computer real quick. So if you can give her maybe a couple more minutes, she'll be able to hop back on my computer since my internet connection is working well. So I do apologize for everyone, and I want to thank you all for coming out today. Sorry about that. We just had some issues here with our Wi-Fi and hookups. Technology, even in these newer days, we still have some issues happening.
Okay, thank you, AJ, for stepping in. And Bonnie, are you able to hear us?
Yeah, she's coming up right now. Give her like
Okay,
1 or 2 more minutes, everyone. I do apologize, but she's coming to my computer right now.
perfect. And while she comes to join us once again, if you have questions to ask her, go ahead and use your reaction button. That way she can call on those that have any questions. Okay. Okay. Okay, and I see on the chat, someone did ask, is there a location where we can take a CPS class? Okay, do you want to expand on that? CPS class, specific on okay. Okay, so you would like to know the ins and outs of how the CPS process works. Okay, so that would be definitely something that we can look into. Kern County Network for Children has monthly trainings, and if that's a topic of interest, we can definitely look into having such training in the future. Thank you for that. Okay. And I do see I'm getting quite a few emails requesting the PowerPoint or the recording. So if you do have questions regarding those, go ahead and send me an email. Like I mentioned, I'll put together a list of those that are requesting it, and I will definitely share those with Bonnie. Okay, so I see that AJ has disconnected from the chat or altogether. So, and then I also see that that Bonnie hasn't connected either. So at this time, we will conclude our training. I do thank everyone for joining us today. If you do have any questions that you wanted to ask Bonnie, please go ahead and email me. I really appreciate everyone connecting. Once again, if you have any questions, you can email me at yavargas@kern.org. Thank you once again for joining us, and this will conclude our training. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will stay posted just for a few minutes if anyone has any questions for me.